on some of the lucky thing. I'm perfectly aware that as a poet, I think you know this. You get lucky sometimes. You hit a line that you had no idea of when you began writing, and you know that it's better than the whole rest of the poem, and you know that in fact that the rest of the poem becomes subservient to it by the end. And this is called Two-Hander with a hyphen there. It says, to my newborn grandson, and the newborn grandson, who's not mentioned here, in fact, is named Sawyer, which is sort of interesting, but it doesn't have anything to do with the poem. It just happened to me. I was amused when I realized that I'm writing about a saw. But anyway, this was to my newborn grandson, who's a lovely boy and is now 5. There was usually a warning. Single quotes. If you're so set on it, my Gramp would be told, go ahead, but keep in mind he's just a little boy. That was Gram. While she was talking, he'd be studying whatever piece of wall he was nearest to, or adjusting his hat, the straw one with the black band around the bottom of the crown. Then out the cottage's back door we'd both go, him carrying the two-hander. It was shaped like a harp. This is 70 years later, a long while for a simile's slow glow to be mounting towards the pages, this one's surface. But the saw's shape never wavered. It hung on pegs in the wall in the entryway and only came down once or twice a summer. The simile's stronger for the weight. Its wooden handles were painted crimson, a dried blood color, as I didn't always know. They were the smoothest things of wood I've ever held. My hands clench remembering them. He didn't say much, my Gramp, but I'd catch him watching me when we were out there, the two of us standing in a pine tree wood on a yellowing pine needle floor. And along with the watching, there'd sometimes be an awkwardness in him, something unsure or shy, glimpses of all those, which may just have been what could he do about the years, such a jumble when he turned to look back, the imbalance between us that words wouldn't fix. And meanwhile, my arms would be stretching out towards him when the saw moved in that direction, and then they'd be pushed back until they were almost behind me, and then further forward again, and everything repeating. When the log started to tilt downwards at its middle, meaning it was about to break into its two new halves, you had to stop right away and lift the blade up and out. I'd probably have taken my t-shirt off by then, and now I'd pick it up and throw it over my shoulder. We'd walk to the stream where, years and years ago, he'd stuck a V-shaped length of tin tightly among the stream bed's stones. A small saucepan was half hidden among the weeds, and he'd fill this from the water running as from a tap out of the front of the V-shaped tin. He'd watch the water settle and clear in his pan, and then drink all he wanted and rinse the pan out before passing it to me. I'd do what I'd watched him do. All this comes from the two-handed saw, which I'm remembering as much of as I can, only because of you, little one, resting among us in your dream of Eden, and a lot smaller than I was then, whose dream never showed the two of us in a wood together, as we will never be. I mean, Dennis Lee, he was a big influence on me. We got along well enough that when he discovered I was writing some poetry, he said he'd really like to see it. So he did see it, and I sent him a manuscript of pretty well book length, which was full of all kinds of garbage, as well as the odd occasional little flash of something. And then he returned my manuscript to me with far more words by Dennis on every page of the manuscript in his tiny but very legible, beautifully written handwriting. Talking about the poem and something, offering little bits of praise where he could force himself to find something to praise, and also though coming clean about the stuff that he didn't think was working. It was very important to me, and I went home and altered the manuscript almost unrecognizably. And then Dennis, who then was the poetry editor for Macmillan of Canada, which in those years published poetry, on behalf of Macmillan, he accepted this manuscript that he had been working on and had altered considerably and improved vastly, accepted it, and that was my first book. And my first 3 books were all published by Macmillan under Dennis's editorship. He was valuable. And Peggy Atwood also, by the way, read that manuscript, the first book in manuscript, and I remember sitting with her, and I mean, that was fun too, because she was sitting in my dining room table with me, and we're turning over my manuscript, and it was funny. She would just turn her page, and her expression might faintly change, and I would say, "Okay, quick," and that would be all we'd say about that. And we practically always, all she had to do was be sitting there, and I would know that this was not going to be in the manuscript, and I fully agreed. So that was valuable too. I really am angry at poets, and there's enough of them around, and I try not to be one of them, whose poetry has to show their great learning, and whose poetry is continually moving away from the average person that might happen to pick up a book and begin leafing. I really I think that many poets, and I could name them but I won't, who do a disservice to you or me or other people who have the same sorts of ambitions that I might feel and I feel, that I would like to be read by people for whom poetry is an unnatural kind of word even. And we've been talking about this, you and I, we know that there's a whole bunch of people whom we do not look down at for it, but for whom poetry is an alien sort of concept, and they shake their heads and turn and look somewhere else. Fine. But I do want to allow that person whom one imagines as the non-poetry reader who randomly picks up a book, I don't want to have him or her turn away from it, put it down and say, "Oh, I always knew I disliked poetry," and start looking for wherever they normally look. I did an English course every year, and it was practically always with Northrop Frye, and if it wasn't Northrop Frye, it was Marshall McLuhan. So I had two of the finest teachers, I think, in the English Lang and Lit field in the world, because I went to Cambridge later and I didn't find any teacher who could hold a nightlight beside either McLuhan or Frye. They were just these two great rivals who didn't have a good word to say about each other, and in fact Frye in particular would get very sniffy when McLuhan's name was mentioned. I almost used to take joy in pointing out to Frye what McLuhan had recently done, to just elicit whatever I could out of it. Anyway, but still, they were both brilliant. Conversation, because Rilke is somebody that has meant a lot to me. For one thing, through my marriage to a German and attempting to understand, to live at least partly in her language as well as my own, I read Rilke, and to leap into a new language with a poet like that is a huge advantage for the language, because I mean Rilke's life is sort of contemptible, but his poetry is anything but. He's a very potent presence in easily my first 10 years of writing. I read not only all of his poetry and knew some of it almost by heart, but I also read his published letters, some of which I read in German and some of which I read in English, and there are paragraphs, there are sentences in those letters. I've said this I may have mentioned it to you when we were talking about poetry in Banff. I certainly have never been trying to safeguard this for myself. I just think it's a treasure house for any writer at any stage, really, even if they're at an advanced stage, they can kind of refresh themselves, go back to some earlier stage of their own development, and if it's earlier than that, so much the better. Rilke has metaphors that are buried in the letters, and I don't think it was ever a case that I took a Rilkean metaphor and just plumped it like comme ça into the middle of a poem, but it can set fire to a trail of thought that will lead you into something you wouldn't have had otherwise. He's richly endowed with that imaginative aspect to literature. I don't know anybody who, I mean, it's maybe an overstatement, but I really would be hard put to find somebody who is as valuable to I think probably in particular a young poet, an early stage poet who's open to influences that are outside his own or her own field of experience. I had read everything that I could find of Kafka. Not in German. Didn't read him in German. I don't know why I didn't, but I did not. But he also is one of these hugely richly imaginative writers, as you know, like Rilke to some degree, that I think he's a wonderful medium for any young writer in particular to kind of immerse herself or himself in, because it's not that it gives you an image in his case like Rilke often did, it's the level of thought, the intensity of thought the unwillingness to say a shallow thing and be done with it. I mean, Kafka just takes these sudden slides into depths that the previous paragraph hasn't even hinted at, and if you find yourself even partially at home at that, then you try to repeat it in what you're doing. It's not a matter of borrowing metaphors, it's a matter just of not doing something that you recognize as shallow and not worth the pages being written on. Little Bird. Yeah, Little Bird is a case of a poem that I had no idea that it was going to happen. It just is a series, as I guess you know, of very short, mostly 4 lines, and a lot of rhyme is built into it. I allowed myself once in a while to give up on the rhyme because I didn't want it to become sing-songy and something that evades sense in the name of rhyme. So the odd thing, the rhyme is either scarcely visible or not there at all. But mostly it is formally that way. Everything is a 4-line stanza, and a lot of it does rhyme. And yeah, that's a curious thing to me too. It just, when it began, I thought it was going to be my typical, at the most 2.5 pages, and it went on, and it just investigated. My father just played more and more of a role in it. I didn't even start it as a homage to my father at all, and in fact I never, even at the end, thought of it as being that, but it was a making good of something.